Okay, everybody, welcome to the show. I'm so glad to have you joining me. I'm here in downtown Little Rock, Arkansas. I'm excited about tonight's show. As you come into the live stream, please grab that URL wherever you're watching. If you're on Twitter, retweet this. If you're on Facebook, share it for me. And if you're on YouTube, grab the URL and share it out. Let people know that you're watching the show and you're joining the conversation tonight. I'm excited to talk about entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship as a path to impact. Tonight, we have a great guest to talk about this topic, and I'm excited for you to meet her this evening. So as you come into the live stream, please go ahead and share out those links so others can join us in the conversation. As always, please drop your comments, your observations, your ahas, or your thoughts and questions into the comments section. I'll try to do my best to bring those comments into our conversation and those questions specifically into our conversations. If you have questions about Sheena's background, her experience in entrepreneurship, and the company she's building now, this is a great opportunity to get all the kind of behind the scenes of building a company. It's not all glitz and glamour. It is a lot of hard work, a lot of determination, and just plain not giving up. So I'm excited to have Sheena join us on the show. As I see more and more people coming into the live stream, I'll just repeat, feel free to drop your comments, questions in the comments, and I'll bring those into our conversation. Please do me a favor here at the top of the hour and share out this live stream so that we can let everybody know that the conversation is going on. All right, let's dive right in. I'm excited to welcome Sheena to the show tonight. She was born in Terry, Mississippi, and she is a graduate of the University of Southern Mississippi with dual degrees in psychology and film. We'll talk a little bit about that. In 2016, she was featured in the documentary film She Started It, and in 2017, she published her first book. She cut her teeth in entrepreneurship with her first company called Sheena Allen Apps. It was a software company. And in 2018, she launched her current company and second venture, CapWay. This company is focused on bringing banking services and education to underbanked and unbanked populations right here in our country. This made her the youngest female to own and operate a digital bank in the United States. She has been featured in Inc. magazine as well as Black Enterprise, and she was named a 2018 Business Insider Under 30 Innovator. In 2019, she was named to the Forbes 30 Under 30 list as well as the Inc. 30 Under 30 list. Wrapping up 2019, she was named to the Inc. Female Founders 100 list. We met several years ago through entrepreneurial groups, and I've watched her growth and her journey over the last several years. She impresses me with her determination, her grit, and her passion for this very important mission. And it's my pleasure to have her on the show tonight. Sheena, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. I'm excited to dive in. I mentioned that you have a liberal arts background in psychology as well as film, and I share a background in liberal arts. I have a music degree, but I'm really curious, how did you jump from psychology and film to entrepreneurship? How did that happen?
Uh, it's crazy enough. I was your model student in high school. I was the kid who got all A's. I played sports. Also, I was in all the extracurricular activities. But when it came time to go to college, I didn't actually question college. To be quite honest, I didn't know if I wanted to do college, and it was mainly because I was very deep into the arts. So I was that person who wanted to kind of go into like drawing and painting and film. I didn't feel like I should probably do a 4-year degree. It ultimately decided to go to college, mainly because of my parents, to be quite honest. And when I got there, I was like, so what do I want to do now that I am here? I didn't want to just waste 4 years and just like I'm going to college just to go. And there's a lot of things I kind of want to kind of dip my toes into, as they say. So film was still my creative outlet. Psychology was actually not about being like a psychologist or a mental psychiatrist. I did psychology because I was more actually intrigued by more like the IO psychology or more about the marketing of psychology. So, why is Home Depot orange? And why are most social media, why do they have the color, blue involved? And why don't casinos have windows? Like I was more intrigued with that part of psychology. So that's what I double majored in, and I actually minored in marketing, which was kind of like a tie-in between the two. And my senior year of college, so I made it through my 4 years. My senior year of college, had an idea for a mobile app, and was not in school for anything technical, but was like, hey, like, I had this app idea. I can't find it in the app store, which the app store was much different than it is now. So this was 2011, so the app store was not as crowded. Couldn't find what I was looking for, and decided that I was going to build it myself. And that was my first step into the tech world.
Wow. And so you had this idea, which all of us have had one or dozens of ideas of an app, but you actually took the step to say, let me go build this. How did you even know where to start? Like, especially this was probably right around the time I think the iPhone came out, maybe in 2010. So this was really early. How did you know where to even start when you had an idea like that?
I it took me a while actually. I did a lot of asking around. I was at Southern Miss, so I went to Southern Miss. And I remember kind of like asking around campus, and we had a computer science department, but I couldn't find anybody to like develop iPhone apps. Because you mentioned the App Store was still very, very young, and so I started. My mom is a business analyst, so she doesn't do coding. I was like, hey, is there anybody at your job that codes, and particularly maybe do like an iPhone app? And she's like, I don't think so. We don't do that type of coding here. And then what I did was I went to the University of Google, as we call it, and I was like, how do I find a developer for the iPhone app? Pretty much is what I did, honestly. And at the time, one of the top freelancer websites used to be a website called guru.com. Still around now, but it's not, it wouldn't be the top one that I would recommend. But went to Guru and searched for a freelancer who does iPhone apps. Found one, and I actually took a loan out from my dad, which wasn't much. It wasn't as costly back then to do like get an iPhone app done, because you could find freelancers who did it for pretty cheap. And yeah, that was my first step into getting my first app. And what was crazy is I didn't know at the time, but I found a developer who developed my app, but I did my own spec sheets, my own flow charts. I did the designing myself, did my own QA, my own testing. And I didn't even know at the time I was doing all that, to be quite honest. But come to find out, that's what I was doing. So yeah, that was my first step into the tech world, figuring it out all on my own.
That's such a, I guess, a part of entrepreneurship is figuring it out and not realizing until you're in it, like what you've actually done. I think that's really important to demystify some of these things that as entrepreneurs, sometimes the very famous entrepreneurs get awareness and it's, this is a hard grind and it's really, it's a lot of luck. It's, asking a question, somebody, getting lucky when you find a developer that turns out the right way. And we all know the entrepreneurs that found the wrong developers too,
Yeah.
and challenge. I'm sure you have those stories as well, building apps. So I'm curious, kind of in your background, you were really interested in arts and kind of just came at this purely from this is a problem, a thing I want, an idea I have, and I want to build it because I don't find it anywhere else. When you were looking at kind of working into entrepreneurship, were you surrounded by entrepreneurs? Had you seen, was that a viable option for you growing up, or had you seen, are either of your parents entrepreneurs or the people around you entrepreneurs, or was it just something you truly stepped into?
My dad would like mow lawns on the side, if you want to call that being an entrepreneur. I have an uncle who owns a flower shop, so I guess like small type of things like your mom and pops, or kind of like your side hustles, as we also call them. But true entrepreneurship, no, I didn't. It was truly just figuring it out all on my own, and in my first company, I can say like I made those mistakes as far as like file taxes when you get employees and payroll taxes. I didn't have anybody to kind of like piggyback off of from that. I mean, I asked people eventually, but as far as seeing it, or I have somebody in my family where I saw it and kind of piggybacked off of that, no. It was one of those truly just kind of stepping outside of the comfort zone and figuring it out.
Excellent. I'm going to pause here as you all, the audience, as you're coming in. I've seen more and more people coming into the live stream. We're here with Sheena Allen, the co-founder or the founder of and CEO of CapWay, and we're talking about her entrepreneurial journey, as well as we're going to be diving into the world of fintech and banking and really this mission of providing banking services and education to underbanked and unbanked people in our country. It's a bigger problem than you may expect, or you may be surprised at the scope of the problem. I'm excited to dive into this topic, but as you come in, as we go through this conversation, I do want it to be a conversation. Please drop your comments in the comments wherever you're watching. If you're on Facebook or YouTube, wherever you are, drop your questions or your observations in the comments, and I'll bring those into our discussion as well. I'm excited to continue this conversation. So I want to pivot a little bit, Sheena, and talk about CapWay. But first, I'd like you to share with us a little bit about the current banking landscape in the United States, specifically when it comes to the underbanked or unbanked. Number one, what does that term mean, or those terms mean, and how big is the problem in the United States?
Yeah, so unbanked means this that means that there's someone who does not have a bank account at all. They're relying only on alternative options. And then underbanked means that this is someone who probably has a bank account or some form of working with a financial institution, but they're still not getting the what they're needed to be really financially healthy. And that can range from, they have a payroll card, so they have direct deposit, but there's not really a system that you can build from outside of payroll cards, or maybe they're using Cash App, or maybe they're using Venmo or PayPal. But a lot of people don't understand that those are actually just prepaid cards. Those It's not an actual bank account. It's not a banking system. You're not really growing financially by using those services. So unbanked, no bank account at all. Underbanked, probably have some form of access to some type of financial tool or institution, but it's nothing that's going to help you grow to be financially healthy overall.
And do you have any kind of idea statistically, like how much of how many people in the United States are experience this lack of access to the banking system? Do you have even ballpark figures of how big that is, how big that problem is?
There's a lot of data out there. None of it necessarily is all the same, but some of the numbers range from 1 in 4 households in America is unbanked or underbanked, all the way to about anywhere from 25 to 50 million Americans being unbanked or underbanked. So you somewhere within the ballpark of all that is where you find people who just completely lack access. And that's talking just unbanked, underbanked. That's not even getting into the conversation of being financially underserved. That's just unbanked, underbanked in general. We didn't even get into like the predatory and the living paycheck to paycheck and having to pay minimum balance fees. That's just purely unbanked to underbanked. But when you scale that to talking about overall financially underserved, those numbers grow greatly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I remember as a child, probably 8 or 9 years old, I started carrying papers. And one of the first things that my parents did, or my mother did, was take me to the bank, and she set up a little checking account and a savings account with me, with her on the account. And so I was exposed to that so early, and I lived in a big enough city where, we had lots of banks around, and I could get an account. And I never realized that there are people that just don't even have access to it. How did you go from?
Most people don't actually know that. What's really interesting is you'll be amazed at the comments that I got a chance to see, and how many people were so surprised when COVID happened. And you saw the government that was like, wait, we're trying to get people stimulus checks, but we didn't realize that so many people don't have a bank account, and we're going to have to figure out how to get paper checks out, to so many Americans. And it was a lot of people that I was seeing like on Twitter or just on social media in general. They would be like, how do you live in America and not have a bank account? And I think it was a lot of people just didn't realize that there are a lot of people who don't have bank accounts in America.
Yeah, absolutely. As you were going, so how did you go from, building apps to starting a fintech company? Because those are really different kind of, I mean, it's still technology enabled, but that's a really broad jump and a huge jump like that. Of all the industries I would jump into or not jump into is banking, education, a lot of these, healthcare perhaps, like these things that takes a long time to make changes. How did you decide I'm going to take on this gigantic mission?
Yeah, it kind of honestly goes back to even when I started my first company, and that is not knowing, not knowing what I was getting myself into kind of helped along the journey. Um, and the reason I compare that to my first company is I remember getting into technology and going out to San Jose, which is kind of like the heart of Silicon Valley, where all your big tech companies are. And like some people was asking me like, what made you jump from Mississippi to Silicon Valley? And I was like, well, I Googled it, and Google said that if you want to do a tech company, you go to Silicon Valley. I had no clue, honestly, had no clue that being from the South, being a female, being black, like that is not what you do. As far as it's not what you see in the tech world. Because I didn't know, I never questioned it twice. It was like I want to do this, and I want to figure it out. Kind of honestly the same thing with banking. I mean, I knew that banking was a highly regulated industry. I think that's kind of just what most of us know who've had access or understands at least banking. We know that it's a highly regulated industry because when we sign up for banking, you have to go through like the social security number and all of that. But I did not know exactly how in depth it was as far as regulatory laws, risk, compliance, what all it would take to build a bank. Um, so not knowing was one thing that didn't stop me from doing it because I didn't know getting into it. It was going to take so much. And when I got into it, I was like, well, I'm here now. And then the second thing that really got me into it was I did purposely go into it wanting to make a change. And so when I was seeing that, we were moving to a cashless economy, there's places now that, and I'm especially in bigger cities. When I'm in bigger cities, I'll go into a restaurant and there's a sign on the door that says, no, we don't accept cash or card only. And so knowing that we were moving to a cashless economy, I knew there were going to be a lot of people who were already unfortunately part of this huge income gap or access gap. And then you're going to add on being having to be cashless on top of that. It's going to be a huge issue. And so the benefit that I knew that I had was I had the personal experience of coming from a banking desert. I come from Terry, Mississippi, but I had the professional experience of building an actual tech company. So my thing was, how do I put those two things together and really make a change when it comes to the lack of access to not just banking itself, but financial tools?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's part of it, which is interesting. Like the mission of what you're trying to do is not just the access to the tools, which is really important, but also how do I use these tools? I noticed on Facebook several comments have come in about people being misinformed about tools or unaware how to use the tools, whether it's debit cards, credit cards, and then there's even more sophisticated tools. You mentioned payday lenders and these things and predatory lenders that really prey on people not knowing this information. And I'm curious about your journey as an entrepreneur, as you dive in and you don't realize kind of what you're jumping into, maybe, and you begin to go out there and look for people who will buy into your mission, that will understand what you're trying to do. You go to Silicon Valley as a Black female founder, and there's broad disparities in tech, with founders of color and women and all of these layers. How do you begin to break through when you're maybe meeting with VCs or investors or different people saying, hey, I have this vision for this digital bank, especially if they are not don't even know that this problem exists? How did you start to approach that problem?
It's funny because it's still not easy. Let's not make me. I don't want to sound like it's still easy, but it's especially when I first started doing this and I was pitching to investors. I had investors who would ask me, did you make up the word unbanked, or is there a market even big enough for people who don't have access to financial tools? And I mean, these were genuine questions, but when you have a lot of investors who've only lived in places like New York or Boston or San Francisco, they've never made their way outside of those areas, so they don't know. I remember doing our pitch deck, and I was pitching, and on our pitch deck, there's a I talk about the fact that there's like no Wells Fargo in the state of Louisiana, and somebody like stopped me in the middle of pitching and was like, is that correct on your slide? Like there's no Wells Fargo in Louisiana? And I was like, yeah, there's no Wells Fargo in Louisiana. And it's like, there's no Chase Bank in Mississippi. There's no, I mean, there people in these bigger states and who live in these bubbles, they think that national banks are like everywhere. And I'm like, so that is actually not how it works. They are not everywhere. And then when you think about people who have just historically been underserved, um, they don't really trust even the bigger corporate banks anyway. They have a history of discrimination. They have a history of redlining. They have, their history is pretty long when it comes to why I don't want to trust you or probably bank with you anyway. But it was and still is actually quite difficult. I pitched recently, and I was in my pitch, I spoke about how 52% of Americans live in the same 9 states: California, Florida, Texas, New York. Like 52% of Americans live in the same 9 states. And usually, when you think of corporate banking, when you think of where most of financial services and tools have been placed, they've been placed to those 52% of Americans. However, 48% is still a huge number. That 48% though is then though spread out across the other 41 states. And it's like no one's really paying attention of how do we bring the next generation into the next generation of finance. Because my mom, my grandmother, they walked into a branch and they started a bank account and they went to a teller and handed the teller their money. Um, Nobody who's 20s is thinking about walking into the local bank branch and starting a bank account. Millennials are actually coined the unbanked generation. I mean, if you Google it, you'll see they're coined the unbanked generation, where we are, because we made that shift from I'm going to walk into a bank branch to I'm going to do everything on my phone. And then you have the generation that's coming after millennials, which is Gen Z, and the only thing that they've ever known is digital. So they're not going to be quick to walk into a bank branch. But what has happened in speaking of that, and when I'm pitching to investors, what I have to try to get them to understand, and when I'm pitching is, if I take a kid right now out of Little Rock, Arkansas, and he's never been outside of Little Rock, Arkansas, I guarantee you that if he's probably 18, 19, 20, he's on social media. So although he's never been out of Little Rock, social media has shown him the world. He now knows what it's like in New York. He now knows what it looks like in Japan. And in doing that and being social, he also now wants to participate in having Netflix, having Spotify, ordering from Amazon Prime. But you have to have plastic to be able to do those things. And if I've only known being cash based, or if I've only have a savings account in my local credit union, I'm now limited to being able to participate as a millennial or the Gen Z into today's cashless economy. And that's a whole world out there. That's 48% of people who are in that same bucket that traditional banking has completely overlooked. And so that is what I have to break down more of, like numbers and show maps. And this is the world of a lot of people that most people are just completely overlooking. And you spoke about the literacy piece even before this, and the education is so important. It's important for I'm giving literacy to investors in one degree, but when I'm speaking to the audience that we're serving, I'm speaking a different type of language, but it's still about education. And so, we do a lot with literacy. As we do a lot with financial literacy. It's not just giving quote unquote banking. It's how do we give the education behind finances. And so an example is, in one of our financial literacy programs, one of our more popular questions is we ask in our financial topic under assets and liabilities, we ask the question about what's your dream car. And we get people to give a range of things, but I'll give an example. If somebody says my dream car is a Range Rover, and we're like, cool, okay, Range Rover costs $150,000. When you drive off that car lot and you get to your house, Range Rover worth. And most people will choose the option of $150,000. And it's like, no, the minute you drive that car off that car lot, it depreciated in value. When we get to the stock market, is how much you pay for your last pair of Nike shoes. You might get someone that says, oh, I paid $250 for some LeBrons. I love them. Then, we come back and say, you could have bought 2 shares of Nike for that same pair of Nike shoes. And it's not us saying, hey, stop everything you're doing and buy into the stock market. But I want people to understand that it is feasible for you to do that. And most people just don't understand, and they feel like it's not touchable, it's untouchable for them. And we want to make sure people know that everything from how debit works, for credit works, how the stock market works, making sure that you understand how depreciation works. It's not just giving banking, it's really giving a whole system. And when I started CapWay, I will say the minute I started, even though we've grown since then, we've scaled since then, things have changed. You pivot when you do, startups. But one thing that has not changed is I knew from the very beginning I was in this to challenge the traditional banking system. I was in this to challenge the current financial structure because it just does not work for a lot of Americans.
Yeah, when you think of 40% of us live outside of, or more than 40% live outside of the reaches of the system, it leaves so much on the table, asset wise as well as talent wise, all these other things that are intersectional with access to capital and access to, being able to use services, simple things we don't think of, most of us don't think about, like you mentioned, being able to have a Netflix subscription or a Spotify subscription and all of those things. When you started with this idea, when it started to germinate, was there a specific event that happened or something you observed that made you think, oh, there's something here? Or how did you know, like, because now you have all this, the data and statistics you've built for your pitch when you go to talk to people, but I don't know, like, until I've heard you or seen you on social media talk about these issues, I didn't know. I think a month or so ago, you were on Twitter with or Instagram with Alexis Ohanian, and you all were talking about this thing, and I was like, whoa, this is. I think that's when I reached out to you because I was like, this is an issue we need to talk about. What is it? Where did you see that, or how did the idea start to germinate?
It was really looking at people in my family, looking at people in my community.
Mm.
Not to mention, I'm, being from Terry, Mississippi. This is what I grew up as, all that I knew. And when I left Mississippi, seeing people kind of do things differently in bigger states and bigger cities, um, and just understand that not only were we financially underserved because we were living in banking deserts, just the tools and the things we had access to were just not the same. And there's no reason that because I don't live in New York City that I shouldn't have access to the same financial services or the same financial tools. No, I'm not paying, I don't know, $3,000 for a month for an apartment, but that still has nothing to do with the fact that I'm still part of the same credit system. So I'm still being judged by my FICO score the same way that you're being judged by your FICO score, and which is a whole other conversation because credit scores don't really reflect a lot of people's true financial behavior. But because of where you're based or because of how much money you make shouldn't mean you don't have the same access to becoming financially healthy. And that was another thing I think that I became very frustrated too with just even when I kind of got the idea for CapWay and I kind of started diving deeper into it, and I would just see comments and I would see people say things. I'm just like, that is just not the case. It was, well, somebody's living paycheck to paycheck, and somebody would come in and say, oh, well, you should just work harder. You should get another job. And it's like most of these people have 2 or 3 jobs already. Like, what do you mean they should get another job? Or, I had an uncle who passed away not long after he retired, and he actually didn't have a retirement. And I remember the conversation with him, and it was because lack of financial education. And when he got that job, and he was like 20, and mind you, he's retired at 65. He was like, I needed all my money. Now, a retirement account, 401k plan meant that I had to put a percentage of my paycheck into like this fund account, and I needed like all of my money. Now realizing that, when I retire, if I don't do that, I'm pretty much left with nothing. For baby boomers, at least they do have Social Security, but they expect the millennials and Gen Z might not even have Social Security. So honestly, it's a lack of education, but it's also a lack of some of the services that are needed to be financially healthy long term.
And so when you started CapWay, was the original idea to provide the education component, or did you always know this is going to be a banking organization? How did those two kind of elements blend in the birth of the company?
was always banking. So I started out knowing that I wanted to do banking.
Mhm.
Financial literacy or the education component was not far behind though. I am a strong believer in that you can give somebody education, financial education, but if you don't give them the tools to put the education to use, it's kind of no purpose in giving them the education. The analogy I'll use is I think we've all talked about. I learned X in school and I don't use it at all anymore. Like, why did I learn that? I think it kind of goes back to financial education. Now, I'm an advocate that I think you should be talking to your kids at 5 about money, 10 about money. My nephew's 11. I talk to him about money. But at CapWay, my purpose of it was if I'm going to give you a banking system, I want to give you the education that you can also use our banking system to put that information to use. And so literacy was always a component to the banking, but the core of what I want to build was always the banking. But financial literacy just played a very huge role in that.
Well, and that to your point, if you don't have the literacy to begin with, if you don't have the knowledge, you don't know where to get it. I tell my students in my entrepreneurship class, the most difficult thing an entrepreneur, one of the most difficult things an entrepreneur has to uncover is what they don't know they don't know. And
Yep.
I think it's the same in this scenario where if you can want the best for your children or your grandchildren, but if you don't have the knowledge or the access, you can't hope to pass it on. And we only see what is modeled in front of us or what we see. Like I mentioned, I went to the bank and my mom got me this account and I did those things and I made better choices or worse choices based on my knowledge. And several of the comments in the comments have said the same thing. You know, I have a colleague who uses somebody, my friend Daniel said he has a colleague that uses a credit card as a reverse savings account and just basically goes into debt every month, opposite of savings. And but if you don't know, and to your point, you have, you know, multiple jobs, you're trying to make ends meet, you need all your money to survive, it puts you in a really precarious environment.
Yeah,
And
I mean, it's a two-way street. When I say
mm,
that, as I mentioned, I wanted to build banking, but I wanted to make sure that literacy was part of that so that they could use the information at that time. But I think the same thing is opposite. I think that if you give someone access to banking or you give them access to tools or that they have never had before, but you don't give them the education on how it properly
yeah.
works, it's the same thing. Probably one of the best examples, because it's a well-known example that's used a lot, is you give a basketball player who came from a lower income background, and he goes to the NBA and he makes $20 million, and then you wonder why he blows through his money. Well, he wasn't really given the proper education of how it works to have $20 million right now. And so I think it works both ways. I want to give them the banking along with the information of how to properly put the information to use through our banking, but I don't want to give them banking without the education at the same time. So once again, the core from the beginning was banking, but education has always and will continually play a huge role as Capway.
Yeah, absolutely. The next, and I'll break in here, we're about halfway through. So glad you all have joined us for the show. We're talking with Sheena Allen. She's the CEO of CapWay, founder of CapWay, has been building this company now for the last 2 or 3 years and really working to scale access to financial services, specifically targeted for the unbanked and underbanked in our primarily rural communities, but those areas outside of the reach of these large mega banks. One thing you said a few minutes ago that kind of I mentioned at the beginning that I admire your grit and determination, and sometimes when we use those are buzzwords. But you said something. I always knew it. You said I always knew that I was wanted to do banking. Banking services came first, and then the education. But you also said that I wanted to really challenge the infrastructure, challenge the systems. And I think this is a really important point, specifically within the context of capitalism and entrepreneurship, how valuable entrepreneurship or building a startup can be for pushing real systems change. How do you see that in the mission of your company in really challenging these systems that have been established for millennia, perhaps, hundreds of years for sure, and in our country for a couple of hundred years, specifically to exclude at first women and people of color and non-landowning men and, all of these things. It was specifically structured to exclude people. How do you see your mission in pushing to be able to challenge those systems that are entrenched?
It's I once I figured out what I had taken on. You asked it earlier, like, did you know what you were taking on at first? No, I did not. But once I realized the magnitude of what I was taking on, one thing that I carry with pride, one thing that I do every day when I'm getting 2 hours of sleep, um, is the fact that people have really relied on or become fans of CapWay, not just because of the software that we have, not just because, you know, our banking looks cool. It's because I look different as a founder. When you think of most banking products, whether it's traditional banking, whether it's some of these other mobile banks, neo banks, if you probably look across the board, the founders, they're probably going to be older Asian or white males. And this next generation that is coming up from millennials and Gen Z, they're just totally different. I think that this next generation is so resilient and they're so different. And, even when it came down to what has been happening the last few months, and you've seen a lot of like the Black Lives Matter movements, you look up and you see every race marching. It's not just one race. It's not just one or the other. It's you look and it's mostly. I mean, it's people of all ages, but this next generation is just totally different. And I say that to say when it comes to banking and me leading a bank account, a bank, in general, people get bank accounts. I come from the South, which you don't really see when it comes to somebody trying to own a large bank. I'm Black. I'm female. I'm young. I'm not one of the older guys who you see with banking. And so when people leave us notes or they write in emails or they leave notes on social media, it's honestly from people of all colors and sometimes of all ages, but it's definitely the younger people who will say, "Hey, I feel like you get me. You're not one of the old guys. Like you actually know what it's like to be 30. You know what it's like to be 25. So you're gonna build something that's gonna help me in the next the next level of my life." But then it's also even outside of that is I think there's a level of hope that everybody gets when something different comes. And once again I take great pride and I take great responsibility in doing that. So it's not just about being the title of being something under 30 for Forbes or it's not even the title of being the youngest Black female to own a digital bank. It is actually saying people are going to look at me and say, this is a change. This is not, once again, this is not the white male that's running the bank account the corporate way. This is somebody who understands me. I see myself in this person. They're going to build something that's going to be from my generation onward. And this is what's going to, I now understand it because it's not going over my head. I'm big, even internally. I don't say this just because I don't know I'm doing this live. Even internally, I'm always like, anytime someone says something like dumb it down, I'm like, no, like we're not dumbing anything down. This is never a situation of us dumbing something down. We're simplifying it and we're bringing it to a situation where we're meeting people where they are. Unfortunately, when you don't understand your audience, you're going to always think and build something one way when your audience is probably thinking an entire different way. So, I mean, like I say, an example I gave was even when people talk about, oh, you should get more than one job. I'm like, most people have 2 or 3 jobs, or you should do this. And it's to your point. My grandmother used to say something very similar. She used to say, it's hard to blame someone for what they don't know. And that's one of the issues that we've had for so long. And I think that CapWay has given people hope. And so I definitely take great pride in being the founder and in pushing the envelope and challenging the infrastructure. And is that going to be easy? Without question? Not at all. You have a lot of these big banks that have some of these regulatory people in their back pocket, the lobbyists in their back pocket, and rightly so. They're worth $3 trillion, $2 trillion. But my goal isn't to walk around with $3 trillion and take $35 billion from somebody in fees. My goal is how do I change the next generation so that we at least get access and opportunities across the board.
I think that's really important. when you were talking about like not dumbing down this information, but really making it accessible, it goes back to this conversation of access to resources, access to opportunity, all of these things that systemic inequity has robbed all of us of, as you know, to become a richer, more vibrant, more diverse country. Daniel commented here, he said, my mom worked in human resources at a company with mostly immigrant workers, and she would strongly encourage those new hires to participate in the 401k, but almost nobody took up the company on that. When you are trying to reach people who have been excluded from access to tools and systems for building and passing on wealth, that's a huge thing, particularly in lower socioeconomic communities, but particularly in African American communities where literally assets were robbed out of banks, out of the land was taken from you. How do you begin to reach your target audience with a message that connects? Because you can say, hey, it's so important, you're going to be 65 someday, you have to invest in your 401k. And in your case, hey, they're going to eat you, your payday lender is, eating you up with interest and fees and all of these things. How do you begin to introduce people to your product and service in a way that helps them make that transition if they've never, and maybe generationally, nobody in their family has used a bank or trusts the bank?
Yeah, so I mean, what I always tell people is there's always going to be a percentage that you're not going to be able to change their mind. Um, and to try to change their minds is a waste of resources and time. Maybe not a waste of resources, because I think that I want to give everybody the opportunity. Now, if they take the opportunity, I can't control that, but I definitely want to at least expose them to it. But even with exposure, there's for sure going to be some people who are just going to say like, nope, not going to do it. It's not for me. But there's also now with this next generation of millennials and Gen Z, people who are more open and willing to try it. And a lot of time it comes from being actually more social and approaching it from more of a social point than it does from more of like a very structured corporate feel. And when I say that is, when I tell people that we built CapWay purposely with more of a social feel than a corporate feel. If you look at our website, look at our app, our wording, our coloring, you get usernames versus just using your real name. That was built from a social piece, and the reason for that is people actually underestimate social influence even when it comes to money. And so the example I'll give you is if Wells Fargo right now said, Steve, we're going to sit down with a few people and have a conversation about money. Just imagine you're in a group of people right now and Wells Fargo is having this conversation about money. I guarantee you most people will hold back or not speak at all when it comes to money. However, think about going on Facebook or going on Twitter. People literally just spill their whole life out on social media. They'll be like, I'm broke. I don't have any money. Like, I'm trying to fight. People literally tell social media their entire life story, like struggles, ups, downs. Um, and people have in this next generation have become very, very comfortable with doing that. And so that was one reason that we built CapWay more from a social field than it does from a corporate banking field. So that's one thing. The second thing is the way that we even acquire customers. And so we have a B2C, which means we go direct to consumers. Somebody hears about CapWay, they can come and sign up and use us, which is great. But we do a lot through B2B2C, through partnerships. And so whether that is through schools, whether that is through employers, whether that's through community organizations. And when we do that, what it allows us to do is really kind of focus on one audience at one time and really educate them on things that they probably wouldn't have known or had misconceptions about beforehand. I know growing up, my dad hated credit cards. He would tell us growing up that if you can't afford it, if you can't put on your debit card or you can't afford to pay cash for it, then you don't need a credit card to put it on there. And then I got older and I realized, okay, well, everybody needs at least one major credit card. But my dad never believed in credit cards. He always believed that you couldn't pay for it, you shouldn't have it. So it's a lot of unlearning that you have to do, and that is something that actually goes part of our literacy, which is unlearning some things that's just generational, and that's really important to what we do at CapWay and kind of changing the mindset. So a social feel, the literacy, but with that literacy, it is part of unlearning what has just been there for generations.
Yeah, that's something that Colton in the comments mentioned earlier. He said, I have friends that are taught that credit cards are bad, so they never use them, not realizing they've been miseducated. And to the point that this is something that is not, maybe it was correct for one time, but it's not, it's different now. Like things are changing so fast. Like even when I was young, like we didn't have the digital capacity that we do now, where I can basically use a bank ever like without ever going to the actual physical bank. Like I walked into my bank when I started, like opened an account, and I said, do I ever have to come back to your I was like, I just never ever want to come back here. And so I think that's changing a lot. I'm One of the things I want to hit on before we kind of, as we wind in the last 15 minutes of this conversation, is this task you have taken on of building this company, and there's a lot that goes into getting this type of venture off the ground. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges that are real world that you faced maybe at the beginning or as you've gone through the last few years? Again, like I said, I think a lot of people look at entrepreneurship as, after it's happened, the flash bang, oh, you built this $1 billion company that's a unicorn and you're worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And it kind of idolizes that lifestyle that's not, for 99% of the entrepreneurs, is not reality. What have been some of the challenges that you've overcome or had to face starting to build a company like this?
Gosh, where do I start?
The
um,
highlight reel.
yes, it's funny. Even my friends, my family, I was like, "You're traveling all the time, and you're in these nice hotels, and you get to
Oh,
go on planes all the time." I'm like, so I'm usually in the hotel by myself.
yeah.
I'm ordering room service. It is super lonely. I hate flying. Like you guys look at it one way, and I'm over here like every time I get on the plane, it's like, Lord, please let me not be like the one in 800th million person who drops out of the sky in its plane. So it's not all glamorous as it looks. I'm not complaining because I'm very blessed, but it's not as glamorous as people think. Some of the obstacles, probably number one, which is probably most obvious, being a female, is fundraising. Women raise, I want to say, less than 6% of venture funding, and women of color raise less than 1%. So less than 1%. It's not even a whole percent, or less than 1%. So fundraising, without question, is the biggest obstacle because of just the stats show why. Outside of that, it is actually really tough. I think one thing that's underestimated in startups, it's really tough building a really great team. Um, I'm sure you tell your students this all the time, but I have to tell even people who come under no who I mentor that the startup game, especially early, is a hire fire game. You're gonna hire somebody and they're not gonna be able to do anything that you need them to do because startup world is totally different from the corporate world. And when I say that, startup world is you're gonna hire somebody and they have to understand that I'm pretty much gonna give you one task and I'm gonna throw you in the woods and I'm gonna hope you come out and you did it properly. Versus at a corporate job, it's like they give you A, B, C, and D. At startups, I give you A, I give you Z, and I need you to go figure out how to do it in between. And that's everybody's not meant or built to do that. So building teams are actually quite difficult to get a really great team for a startup. And eventually you get there, but it definitely takes some higher fire um, pieces to finally get there. So fundraising, building teams, finding our fit was actually was a difficult piece. Most people expected us to be in New York or to be in San Francisco, and honestly, I spent time in New York. I spent time in San Francisco. I spent time in the Bay, the lower end, not north, which is San Francisco. I spent more of the Silicon Valley side. Um, but I didn't want to be there. It wasn't because the best is not there because clearly that's where they are. But for me, it was how am I able to build cheaper? Because your burn rate can make or break you. How can I build cheaper? And how can I build something that I start to feel that I wasn't going to be able to break out of in Silicon Valley? So many people still have aspirations when they start a tech company that I want to go to Silicon Valley. And I think people need to really think about what they're building and if that's really a good fit for them. We joke all the time now that Silicon Valley's problem is how do I get this car to drive by itself? And it has its own impact and reason why they're doing it, which is not all bad. But when I look at real world problems, being from where I'm from, it's food deserts, it's baking deserts, it's people that live in the Delta region. They get sick and there's no hospital that can perform what they need. It's a life or death situation. That's no people, kids who are having to catch two buses or walk because there's no public transportation in their city. Like that's my version of a real world problem. And I think real world problems. And so um, finding a place that fits for you. And I think we've seen, I would say maybe over the last 3 years that we've seen people kind of migrate out of the Bay, New York, Boston. You've seen Cincinnati become big. Atlanta has grown. Different places are kind of more startup hubs now, but I think it's really important to not try to just run to Silicon Valley or New York. And that was something that was a hurdle for us. Where do we fit that's going to really benefit us in building this company out? Um, and probably the last one is you have to be a really great leader when you're running a startup, meaning that you need to put yourself first, emotionally, mentally, physically, but at the same time you're kind of putting yourself last. I know that probably sounds like a huge oxymoron in some degree, but um, for myself, I make sure that I'm mentally healthy. I make sure I try to get enough sleep when I can. Um, Meditate. I read books in the morning time. I try to go outside to make sure I get a breath of fresh air. But at the same time, if it came down right now that this company had $10,000 in the bank, I'm going to pay my employee before I pay myself because that's what it means to be a startup founder. So there are certain parts of you that you have to put first because you are a leader. And, the saying goes, you can't feed somebody from an empty plate. But at the same time, as a startup founder, you are technically kind of putting yourself last because you eat last if it came down to who gets paid this month. So I think those are all hurdles that I think are overlooked when it comes to being in the startup world or entrepreneurship in general. One more I'll mention. I think that regardless if you're doing tech startups, if you're doing anything, the one thing that I think is completely overlooked is the sacrifice. I tell people all the time when my friends are going out and partying or they're taking trips, sometimes I'm in the office and it's like, are you coming? And it's like, well, I got this deadline is due tomorrow and I have this investor and I have shareholders and no, I can't just drop everything and go out for a night of partying because I have responsibilities. Sometimes 9 to 5s are great for some people. I actually hate the whole thing of like everybody should be a leader and you shouldn't be a follower. I think everybody plays a role in the ecosystem of the world. I am 100% the person that respects the janitor. I respect the employees that I have that don't even call employees, I call them team members. I respect the entire ecosystem. Everybody is meant to do something. Everybody's not meant to be a leader. Everybody's not meant to be a founder. Everybody's not meant to be a CEO. You know, there's a lot that comes with that world that most people don't talk about. Because as you mentioned, we only see the TechCrunch headlines where it's like, X person is now worth $100 million, or they raised $20 million, and that's great. But how much equity have they given up? How much sacrifice have they had to do to get there? How many friendships or relationships have they lost to get there? That's the part that no one really talks about, but it is definitely part of the journey.
That is absolutely the real talk. I tell my students the best capital to raise is revenue, and really understanding this idea of when you take investment, you're selling, literally selling a piece of your company. And it's easy to read those headlines of, oh, they raised hundreds of millions of dollars, but the headline the very next week or month could be they lost hundreds of millions of dollars because, like you said, their burn rate was that, and now they're defunct and
Or they
not
were voted
able.
out. We get the whole people being voted out.
Yeah. Oh
I
yeah.
raised $1 million, but now I lost control of my board, and
Yep.
they don't like what I'm doing, so I'm voted out of my own company.
Yep.
So yeah.
It's absolutely the reality of the world. So you talked a little bit about these challenges. As we kind of wrap up this conversation, I'm curious about when you look back over the last 4 or 5 years of the people, the organizations, the groups. Maybe you mentioned you work with different trying to build partnerships as customer acquisition method and tool. Who are the champions you found along the way, or what are the champions that have actually lifted you up in this process? Because you've been at it a long time and you still have a long way to go for what you want to accomplish to really make generational change. Who are some of the champions, or what are some of the champion organizations that have lifted you up?
I mean, there's been so many,
Mhm.
and
That's
everywhere.
not really fair, right? It's like it's
Yeah,
kind of like giving the Oscar speech and saying I'm going to leave out a director or a producer.
because I think everybody that you meet plays a part, and when I say that, I really mean it because another thing is speaking even to the entrepreneurship journey, and even including myself. Some of the people who've helped me out the most have been even entrepreneurs who have failed. And I think we have this bad habit that we only want to go watch like the entrepreneur who was like really successful and get advice from the really successful entrepreneur. But I guarantee you, and I think I'm guilty of this myself, most entrepreneurs who are really successful, some of them kind of sugarcoat the journey. They make it sound like I got here and I don't know, I slept 2 hours, but then I made $20 million. Like, no, that's really not really the truth of how it really happened. But when you speak to someone who has failed, they give you the truth of how they fail, why they fail, and what you can potentially do not to fall into those same steps. So entrepreneurs, not even just organizations, but entrepreneurs that I've met along the way who's failed. Of course, entrepreneurs who have succeeded. You know, organizations, especially in the South, who are still very supportive. The Delta Region Authority, Innovate Mississippi, who I met, earlier in my journey, who I still, stay in contact with now. And when they reach out or I'll reach out, it's still a really good relationship. There's a lot of organizations now that focus on like minorities. So Google has an entrepreneurship program now for Black entrepreneurs. There's a lot of women focused organizations that I've been part of or dealt with that's been really great. And then sometimes also investors. Early in my journey, Backstage Capital was an early investor in us, and Arlen Hamilton has been great. And one thing I loved about Arlen was there are so many investors who say, "Oh, we're here to invest in unrepresented founders." However you define it, that's women, that's immigrants, that's Black, that's brown. But you have a lot of people who say it, but their portfolio don't actually reflect what they're saying. And Backstage, Arlen, Christy, their portfolio reflects that. So it's been a mixture of people, honestly, who have I appreciate every single thing that they've done along the journey, and I never take any for granted.
Yeah, that's something I followed Arlen too on social media over the last several years, and seeing somebody who has walked it also and like really wants to reach back and help others to succeed is really impressive. As we wind down the last minute here, how can people connect with CapWay? What's the best way to connect with CapWay, to open an account, those types of things? And where do you go from here? What's next on your horizon?
Yeah, so you can connect with CapWay. Definitely download the app, iOS and Android, so the Google Play Store and the Apple App Store. If for some reason you don't have either, you can always go to our website, which is capway.co. That's CAPWAY.co. So definitely download the app, get an account, sign up for our financial literacy, get some feedback. We have a few things within there. We have like some money talk sections that we have and different things like that. So definitely just get engaged. Love feedback also. From here, we're focusing really on these next few months of scaling as far as the banking piece. We're scaling the banking, really listening to our customers, what they like, what they don't like, what they want to see added. And there's a few things that we have coming up as far as milestones over the next few months, few years, ranging everything from micro lending to different types of accounts, building credit, challenging the credit system inside the financial system. So yeah, we have a nice road ahead of us. Lots of hard work, but I'm looking forward to changing the numbers of where we are now with unbanked, underbanked, underserved, lack of financial services. So I don't know if I did my job based off of not just changing the numbers, which changing the data is really important. But
Yeah.
you know when you've had a true impact or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's going to be an exciting thing to watch as the attention and kind of the focus of our nation really shifts to this younger generation that is driven to make change in so many ways. There's so much opportunity, and I'm excited. Actually, I years ago when you were starting this company, I was watching what's happening. I'm excited to get the app downloaded, and honestly, if I never have to see a branch and I can just bank, you're the bank for me. So seriously, it's like I just want to be able to deposit with my phone and transfer my money, and so I'm excited
Yeah,
about.
I would joke with people, like you know how like when basketball players or football players, like it was so cool because I was out and this little kid had my jersey on. Like I'm the more the person's like I was out and this person was paying with a CapWay card. So like
Yeah.
that's me.
That's exciting. All right. Well, I want to say thank you first off to our audience for joining, and those of you who will join afterwards and see this on a replay on YouTube or wherever you find us. I'm so grateful that you've spent this hour with us in this important conversation. Join us for future reframes where we take conversations that matter in a variety of industries, a variety of perspectives, typically focused around business, technology, education, and equity in all things. And so I'm excited to continue this journey. I want to thank you, Sheena, for joining us. It's great to catch up after many years. We kind of see each other in passing on social media, usually Twitter or something, or LinkedIn, but I appreciate the work you do. And it makes a difference. It's so important for the company or the country that we all aspire to build and to create a more, as our founder said, a more perfect union for everybody. So thank you for your time this evening, and best of luck with continued success with everything CapWay does.
Thank you so much.